Hi there, and welcome to this live stream. We are talking today about too old for ADHD, and this is for me, is a really important conversation to have because adult ADHD is hugely overlooked, and it's really difficult to figure out whether you should get a diagnosis, what's going to happen when you do, and to navigate what happens afterwards. So if you think you might have ADHD, or that someone close to you might, or that you've had a recent diagnosis, or that you've had a diagnosis a while ago and yet it's still kind of not quite settled for you, then this show should be entirely relevant to you, and hopefully will give you some insight. We are first of all, I want to introduce Sam and Naomi. So hi and welcome to the live stream. It's great to have you on here.
Thank you.
So I am Matthew as well. Obviously this is I kind of do quite a lot of live streaming, but this is the first time I've done this particular one, so this is quite exploratory, exciting for me. We've spoken about this, and we've talked through how to explore this content, and we all came up with this real core thing that there's not a lot of information out there for adults with ADHD at all, and there's even less stuff about what happens around adult diagnosis and late diagnosis of ADHD. So if you go out there and look, you'll see quite a lot of content that's really aimed at children, and stuff that's aimed about, like, transitioning from in education to work. But there's very little about actually integrating the diagnosis if you've already kind of got a life and an adult life. The intention today is really to explore the area and look at some wider understanding of ADHD, perhaps some better language, better understanding of the condition, particularly in adults. We're planning to talk for about an hour, so we can cover a fair bit, but obviously we won't go into too much detail in an hour, and so there's going to be some follow-up stuff at the end, so do check that out. If you're watching live, please do ask questions, get involved. We can bring in questions as they come up. So yeah, if you're watching live, we really want this to be a conversation, so do ask your own questions as well. This is, though, potentially a serious conversation. We might touch on quite serious topics, quite adult topics, and we might also potentially use strong language. So just know that that's a thing, and is potentially around. We're not claiming to be experts about this. This is really about our own experience and our own journey, and really that's why we want your input as well. So please do share your own experiences with us as we go in the chat, and we'll be able to bring that in. So what I'd like to do, the reason I do this is I had a diagnosis of ADHD last year. I'd happened to spend a lot of my career working with neurodivergent people, but got my diagnosis last year for this one, and a lot of my work is focused on this, and a lot of my career has been with people who are neurodivergent. So it's been a huge area and a huge theme, and it's really interesting, the challenges around this for me. And I work with people around developing new stuff that comes from this place and is a positive expression of what you do. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, but what I'd like to do now is bring my other two guests in. Naomi, would you like to go first? Give us a quick introduction.
Yep. I'm Naomi, and I work for ADHD Aware. I used to volunteer for them previously for paid work, and before that I was a service user, I guess, for want of a better word. So yep.
Cool, thank you. Sam, how about you?
I write the blog for ADHD Aware, but I got diagnosed when I was 22 during my masters. I knew for a while, but I was a bit stubborn with actually getting the diagnosis, because I was 22 and 20 and 18, and I was like, oh, I'm going to diagnose myself. And then I got to 22 and I got a diagnosis. yeah, I just thought I wanted to meet more people with ADHD, and I wanted to get more involved in trying to talk about it. So when I saw ADHD Aware and the possibility to write a blog, I was like, well, I do tend to have a lot to say that would be nice to start framing and looking at through a certain lens, which ADHD Aware kind of gave. So
cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's brilliant. And I think we've got a kind of few questions we're going to play with, but as I say, if you're watching live, please do add in your own, and we'll talk those as well. But the one I'd like to start with is, yeah, what did you think about ADHD before it was a diagnosis, before it was something in your like awareness? What was your idea of ADHD?
No, you want to go first?
Okay, yeah, sure. Well, I didn't really know very much about it at all, actually. I had obviously heard of it, but I've only had the diagnosis for 3 years, I think. I'm 45, so it's like a long time to not know much about it, really. And my perception of it was just, I'd heard occasionally some things about children having it, and I knew adults could have it, but other than that, very, very little, really. If I'm honest, yeah, more of this kind of thing that children have, I would say, on the whole. Boys.
that follows in quite well, because that was kind of, I went to an all boys school, and it was a state feed school. So my example of ADHD was the particularly difficult cases. Those were the ones my school cared about. So I thought it was the naughty boy syndrome. I just thought, I don't know where I got it, because now I think of it, it's a bit of an obtuse thing to think, but I just thought it was something someone played on, a bad temper, a problem a few years ago that has manifested. And it was only when people started saying to me, oh, you seem a bit ADHD, but I kept hearing it again and again, that I thought, no, I might actually have to have a look at this. And then my perception entirely changed, and I felt a bit silly.
And I think I very much resonate. I very much associate it as a kind of childhood developmental condition associated with a certain set of quite disruptive behavior. Not necessarily that I thought that was too much in origin from the child, and it was more of an environmental thing anyway, but that it was a childhood thing. Also some stuff around the role of medication, and the kind of, you know, what it means to have a medicatable condition, and some of that was definitely in my head around my idea of ADHD, and that somehow that makes it more serious on some level than certain other ones. There's something kind of around that. If I think about, you know, the conditions for which there are medication, they feel like the big serious psychiatric ones, like schizophrenia and some of the other other conditions, instead of being like a developmental condition or being like dyslexia. So I felt it was slightly different to that, but how, I had no real idea. Yeah, for me, I spent a lot of time around the neurodiversity community. I had a dyslexia diagnosis when I was 6, so I've kind of been part of that for a long time. And I went to a kind of conference thing with some open space where people were just self-organizing, and someone was doing something around neurodiversity, and I went to that, and a good half of the people there, it was for startup founders as well, and so obviously, you know, there's some overlap there, and a good half of the people there had an ADHD diagnosis, and I was sat there thinking, that sounds familiar, that sounds familiar, that sounds familiar. Oh. And it was just like the penny kind of dropped, and I was like, okay, I do need to investigate this further. There was a great tweet I saw a little while ago that was that said, either people with ADHD are going to have to stop being so relatable, or I'm going to have to go and see a psychiatrist. And it was exactly that experience for me. It's like, okay, this sounds really familiar. Yeah. So how about you? What made you kind of suddenly think it was worth investigating?
For me, it was when the struggle against it became more than what I was getting out of it. Before, I'd managed to skate my way through secondary school. I'd managed to skate my way through A levels. I had a lot of hiccups along the way, but I could blag, and I don't think I could fully appreciate that I was blagging. because it felt like a lot of effort. It felt like I was really putting in work. But now I look back, I really wasn't. And I think that was one of the weirder things to get used to, is that when I think all our ideas of it were quite simple before the diagnosis. And I think one thing that starts to expand is that just how pervasive it is. Like you even said that you could relate to these people like more and more, and that generally I think more people can start relating to ADHD. But I even wonder at what point does it separate from the stereotypical idea. I can't remember at what point I actually snapped away from it. It just feels like I suddenly moved into it, and I don't really know when.
Interesting. Naomi, how about you? What made you start to think it was a thing?
Well, I'd had CBT therapy before for anxiety mostly, and I had spoken to the therapist also saying, you know, I really think that it's not this, you know, anxiety isn't the something causing the anxiety, or that there is something else there. You know, I sort of said, oh, I think maybe, I don't know, I thought perhaps I had like Asperger's, although I knew I didn't because I'd already worked with people and had quite a lot of experience with people with Asperger's, so I kind of knew it wasn't. But I was saying, oh, you know, there is a thing, there is something, and she didn't really have any answers for me, so I just kind of went on my way and didn't find the CBT, that particular CBT. Well, not that I've had any since, but I know a lot of people find it really helpful for ADHD, so I'm not dismissing it. But it was, I knew I was already kind of very insightful, although that sounds like a contradiction, things I didn't know I had ADHD. But what I mean is I already kind of knew everything that she was saying to think about. I was like, well, I already analyse my head every day over and over again, so I didn't really get anything out of it. Yeah, and then ADHD Aware started sharing office space with me, the other organisation that I work for, and I just met people, and I kind of knew within, you know, a week or less. I just knew that I also had it. I could just tell from the way that they spoke and the way that they presented themselves and the way that they worked and everything. I just knew, and it was kind of funny, really, because they were all male and all quite a bit younger than me. So it wasn't like I was just kind of relating to it from the point of view of another female of a similar age. You know, it was, yeah, I just knew.
It's really interesting. Just as kind of a side, really, do you both feel that you've kind of got a bit of a kind of ADHD gaydar almost? You know, you've got like a sense of, because I definitely get that sense now that, like, okay, that when I get a certain connection, I get a certain resonance. It's like there's a good chance that you're like this too.
Yeah, I've got a nerdy spin on this, but it isn't nerdy all the way, like, I promise. But there's philosophy I studied, and the reason I got into it is phenomenology, and it's the study of experience. Because in thought, it's all very nice to talk about, but amongst science, experience is a bit of a dirty word. You don't really, you know, no, it's not as good as hard science. However, the one thing I think all those questions just showed that this even demonstrates is that we learn through experience, quite literally. We learn through comparing what other people are. And you're bang on right with the ADHD thing. The amount of times I've met someone that I suddenly, I start, it's almost like when I start to feel an engine really revving, I'm like, no, you've got ADHD. Because, and it sounds harsh, it almost sounds a bit exclusive, but I'm like, normies don't do that.
If I can relax and let a conversation go and someone can stay with me, there's a good chance that they're like, you know, and in these conversations where it's in public, these are, you know, we all kind of moderate a little bit. If this was a private conversation, it would actually have a slightly different form, I think, you know, just because we naturally do it to bridge a gap. But if it's a purely amongst people with it, the energy is just different, isn't it?
Entirely. But I don't. That's the weird of it. When I get to, and I don't know what it is. I try to say what it is, and I don't know. It just ends up feeling a bit exclusive, which I think I do like. Do you think that has to be torn apart? If we're looking at ADHD and you try to talk about it, we say about neurodiverse, and I use the term normies, and I should probably not do that. But it's the amount of times I've seen the word ables for ADHD used in research, and then disabled, like the amount of derogatory language I've used. I use the term normies almost in a rebellion, not even a rebellion, that's trying to be too fancy, as a middle finger. That I don't think it should be demeaned, but now I'm starting to think the other side. How separate should the language be? So not neurodiverse, I think that's a nice example, but for ADHD, how much language should there be that we're developing? Because is that relatability to someone who's also energetic? I don't know, is that exclusive?
It's one of the really difficult things, I think, and this gets into, I want to explore like diagnosis and what that means a little bit, because I think, you know, there's practical stuff around how you get diagnosis, and that's relatively straightforward. But I think for me, the unexpected bits are around like how it feels and what the consequences are, and that's actually been as much the thing. And like what a diagnosis actually is for a condition like ADHD. And I don't think of it as like a medical condition in quite the same way, but it is. But the difference is it is real on some level, on an experiential level. I experience the world qualitatively differently, as far as I can tell, to most other people. And I experience the world qualitatively similarly to other people who have a diagnosis of ADHD. And that's like, well, okay, well, where does that leave us? It's not like a thing where there's just a flip switch, but it's also a thing that is a commonality of experience. And so how do we work with that? And it relates to, you know, one of the really big bugbears of this stuff when you do try and get diagnosis and try and taken seriously. It's like, oh, well, everyone's a bit ADHD. It's like, yeah, kind of not.
That's where I end up then being forced into being excluded, because I don't really like to rely on my diagnosis. This is why when I think of ADHD, I think of it in terms of how I'm talking about it, because I don't want to have to keep relying on a piece of medical evidence that I am dubious of to begin with. I know it's real, I know I have it, but other than that, I don't want them telling me how to deal with it in any way, because I don't trust their opinion. So I don't want to have to rely on their diagnosis fully. But then you find you have to, because then you try and explain it, you kind of can't, and then I'm like, oh no, now my diagnosis does matter. And I've done it at work. I've managed to, I've had to use it. This is where I think the diagnosis is begrudgingly semi-useful. And it took me a while. It was a practical use of it that took me a while to come into it. But being able to know that if I go to my workplace, if I'm having difficulty and someone just thinks I'm, you know, everyone's a bit ADHD, Sam, you just need to work a bit better.
Just
then I know.
Yeah, pay attention. Yeah, thanks.
So far, no one's done it, and I dare them to try. But I've already looked the steps up. I know what to do with the diagnosis. I think in that way, it is useful, and that's one of the most beneficial tools. Is that if you've got bureaucracy to maneuver, unfortunately, it is helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing, and one of the big benefits is, first of all, that you can access medication if that's something that you want to, which can be a useful tool. And I think again, this is again for me thinking about it as a tool to interact in a certain way with a certain, you know, experience in life that just doesn't come that naturally to you, rather than as a cure for something that's wrong. You know, I think of it almost like as an enablement, an aid, rather than as a cure. Because it is contextual and it's not required if you're in a certain circumstance, but it can be extremely helpful if you're in a different circumstance. And I think that access to resources you wouldn't otherwise get, and access to work is another really good example that can get you extra help. And in an ideal world, we'd just be able to kind of do the self-report thing, stand up and say, oh, great, I have these needs. Workplace, would you meet them for me, please? In like society, would you meet me on my own terms, please? It doesn't work like that yet, sadly.
It does. I'd say that this is where a diagnosis comes in as useful, because it slightly does somewhere. And you normally find embellished, I think, within the Equality Act, there are workplace adjustments that, if inexpensive and there are ways to play around with that. If inexpensive, they can be met. And now something I've started doing at work is standing up when I work. I saw a judge do it because she had back issues, and I was like, why have I never thought of doing that? And I can't tell you how weird it is to their work environment to a point to try and stand up. Like if I did that in an office, that I don't think anyone would find anything wrong with it, but they just think it's a bit odd. And that's where the moment you say diagnosis, no more questions. And they're allowed to do it because it's inexpensive. If they think, well, put his desk on stilts, give a laptop holder, job's done. And it does genuinely help me. But if you go in without that backing for it, or having gone through any of the process, or even sometimes with medication, I find the reasonable adjustments work because I'm medicated, and that I can help supplement the medication rather than myself. It slightly leads me somewhere.
I think that for me, that narrowing down of the field as well is helpful. There's so many options out there. It tells you, it's like, okay, well, you have this cluster of conditions and these kind of things have helped other people who have got a similar cluster, rather than it being like, this is the answer. But yeah.
I kind of thought they were. I don't know about you two, but I stupidly kind of thought they would be. And I was a bit sad to learn the consequences that can come with them, because it is a bit of a double-edged sword. It really is. I can't sit on that. This is the one part of the process that I'm really middled on, is that when people say to me, what would you advise as the best route forward for any therapeutic intervention? I have no idea. I couldn't, for someone else, I don't think I could fully inform them. I could only ask them the questions I ask myself. Because I don't know about how therapies works. I've never gone down it, but the medication route can be a little bit rocky. So and at the point, I really wanted it to work, so I could ride that wave a bit. But I've met plenty of people, funny enough, like chefs, who don't need it. Their therapy is in their action, and I think there's quite a thing to that. And they don't. I would never say for them to take it. Sorry,
I really want to bring Naomi in because I'm aware you haven't spoken very much, but also I wanted to go off on one, talk about chefs and kitchens and the kind of environment where people with ADHD find themselves in naturally very often. But yeah, so I think that experience thing, and yeah, how did you find that side of it, Naomi? The kind of how to work with it, how it helped, perhaps.
Well, to have the diagnosis. Well, it helps. Yeah, I mean, I found the medication that I'm on really, really helpful. So, yeah. So, of course, if I hadn't got the diagnosis, then I wouldn't be taking a medication. So, yeah, it just helped me really the meds really helped me to stabilize my emotions, which have been, I realise now, what were a huge problem to me. Massive, like I think before I used to think that everybody bursts into tears every day and things like that, I just thought these things were not, it's very funny looking back. I think, gosh, what a way to live, really, this kind of daily emotional roller coaster, But yeah, I think also I've had a lot of really good support where I live around accessing services for ADHD, which is seemingly quite unusual, sadly. It seems I'm the person that answers all the emails to ADHD aware. A lot of people just are really floundering, and I know we'll probably come on to sort of like getting a diagnosis or whatever in a minute, I expect. But yeah, it's really hard. But no, I found it really good. I still haven't really got to the stage, I don't think, where I'd have the patience to do any other kind of therapies or things like mindfulness or yoga or anything. I just cannot imagine ever being that regulated to be able to do it.
If I may, Naomi, did you like land on that first medication and that one worked for you, or did you have to try one or two?
No, first of all, I was on what's the one that the where you get oh
Ritalin.
Ritalin, yes, sorry, yeah. And
Methylphenidate, yeah.
That just made me really, really hyper, just ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, I tried Ritalin first time.
Just not good at all. And then now I take atomoxetine, which is just it's just amazing, really. It was actually at the kind of like I went to a support group, and everybody there was just saying, oh, you should go on to this. And I was a little bit dubious because a lot of people in the group didn't seem to have very much kind of, they did seem a little bit like one flew over the cuckoo's nest. But looking back, it's not, I don't think it was them. It was that I was so over the top and so manic that they probably just didn't even know what to, to say or anything, and probably just like, oh, okay, they were like, yeah, you really should think about some medication. It wasn't like I was like that all the time. It was just that being in the group and having to talk about ADHD, which was a very new sort of thing for me, and yeah, I was just like completely wound and stuff. So yeah, it's been good. It's not been without its drawbacks, but then I've been on other medication for, say, depression for years, anxiety and depression, because of, now I know, undiagnosed ADHD. So I'm kind of used to the side effects and drawbacks. So yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, I happened to land on one that worked straight away.
Oh,
yeah. So yeah, that was also partly with a psychiatrist who was willing to prescribe. I take Alvance, lisdexamfetamine, which is usually not prescribed first because it has high abuse potential, i.e. it doesn't make you miserable. It works.
Ritalin had a slight inverse in that the what we will term abuse potential felt much more of a potential, because it gave me this weird up that like was quite physiologically exhilarating, and that was the bit that I thought, oh no, I can see how a dependence is going to build there. Whereas without that, the reason I like it is because I don't know what changes, but just all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I can keep my head still. That was the first thing I noticed when I took it. I was like, I was staring at things and I just thought how amazing it was that I wasn't doing this just all the time.
I laugh because
the game changer.
The first day I took it, I sat down and had a phone call. But for people who aren't, who don't have ADHD or are differently, who are differently neurodivergent or are neurotypical, one of the really common markers with ADHD is wandering around whilst talking. And fidgeting in general, but that often manifests in like I wander around any space I'm in on a phone call, and I still do it. But the first day I took the meds, I was like, I just sat down and had a phone call, and I was like, I just had an hour-long conversation, sat down. This is really weird.
And I've got a quick question, because this is one I've always thought, is this just me? Did you have that moment where you suddenly thought, oh, wow, this is what attention actually feels like? Because particularly when I was studying, I kept looking at my mates, and I just noticed how they could just do that. And my girlfriend does it. She's a titan with it. She can just sit down and look at her computer and write for hours. And I can't tell you how many layers I don't understand that. And even medicated, I'm still...
For me, it was like that. I have experienced that attention before, but the way I did it was by making myself so anxious that I could use that tension to constrain it and like focus it. So I knew the attention, what was great for me was like, oh, I can pay attention without torturing myself. That was my experience. That was the revelation for me. Oh, it doesn't require a huge amount of anxiety and like pressure to be able to pay attention. So that was my experience.
What about you, Naomi? Did you find, has there been a difference of attention, or have you just thought Because I wonder it, like there probably are some people who must just think, now I've been able to mediate a little bit when I need it, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've got much better at really listening to people. I think I used to be a bit kind of just think about other things, which is obviously really rude, but it wasn't my ever my intention to be like that. But I've noticed people respond to me a bit better now in a conversation, you know. But I mean, I can still be very animated, which both you two have seen before, and I'm trying not to do that in this instance, because otherwise I would just get really carried away. So, for example, like I'm sitting on one of my hands at the moment, and like I've got this, which I'm just kind of like poking the cat with, because otherwise I even I'm doing it now. I get so distracted even by myself.
Yeah.
But I have actually found, since doing a lot of stuff on Zoom and the on the computer, basically talking to people, that I've also become so much better at taking turns to speak, and not gesticulating as much, and being calmer, really. So it's been like a mirror, you know, which you don't normally have when you're just in a meeting. So that it's been really helpful, actually. It's been really good to have that kind of reflection. But generally, I mean, I've on the weekend, a week ago, I set up my hot tub by myself and actually followed the instructions, which I couldn't believe it. Like, in the past, I would have just been like, I'm not doing that, and I'm certainly not reading the instructions. It would be completely overwhelming. It would be like, and then the next day, sitting in my hot tub, like, chilling out, thinking, I did this, and it's a really nice feeling to actually not give up on stuff and see things through, and follow. I mean, I'm still not a massive fan of instructions. I would do almost anything to avoid them. A bit like I hate measuring things. Those are my things that I just avoid. I like to just guess and then deal with the consequences of whatever. But it's helped. Really has helped a lot.
Funnily enough, for me, I still, even medicated, can't build anything to save my life. I tried to put my bed together, and I put the drawer thing itself on upside down, still medicated, and I even chose the good day in the day to do it, and then the other bit upside down. So there are still some bits I found where it's as if medication works amazingly, but then all of a sudden there's this little realm where I feel like it can't touch. And even you mentioned, Matthew, the phone thing. I find it peaks and troughs sometimes.
Yeah.
Where actually sometimes I find phone calls unbearable.
Oh.
But then other times I can slightly do it. But actually, I keep giving it away. I've done the same thing as you, Naomi. I've got a fiddle thing because I sort of find that necessary. There we go. Even with medication, I still need this. So it is a weird half house. I wouldn't tell people against it, but don't put your pen down because you might need to fiddle with it.
And I think that's actually one of the things is like thinking about medication and how you approach this, and the stuff in general, like some of the interventions and ways of coping. And I did want to go back to the kitchens thing, because it's such an intense environment. A lot of people are drawn to it with ADHD, are drawn to very, very intense environments, chaotic or borderline chaotic ones, almost because we're comfortable there. We're much more comfortable there than most other people are. And so the chaos in the kitchen, or emergency medicine, or a whole load of environments where you get that kind of buzz, and it is chaotic enough to hold your attention, and you don't have to think. You don't have to then consciously attend, because it's okay to have the disparate, that being able to attend to 3 things at once or 4 things at once becomes an advantage, because you can be, oh, that's burning, or like, oh, that's and that kind of distributed attention actually becomes an advantage. Yeah. So I think it's really important to note that this is this is a environmental fit thing to some large degree, and the other side is actually creating an environment and creating a lifestyle over time that actually works properly for you, so you don't need as much medication. And I think for me it's also about like not trying to medicate away the problem, but just being like, okay, this is enough to deal with this particular issue that is particularly bothering. Because for me, there is the downside of the medication is not like explicitly side effects. I get very few side effects actually, in terms of physically, but it does close me down a bit. I definitely don't think as freely when I'm on the meds as when I'm not. So if I want to do something completely like creative and like completely tangential, I can't be taking the meds. So it's like I'm balancing that out, because I want some of the ideas, but I don't want the fire hose of ideas that's completely overwhelming. And so it's like, well, how do I turn the tap down a bit without losing it completely?
I personally haven't been able to. I don't know if this is part personality trait, part feature, because you mentioned at the start that you feel like a qualitative difference in how you interact with the world, and I've started terming it a modality, because I like that word. It's a nice, it sort of describes like a little box of difference that is contained within itself and explained within itself, because that's kind of what it feels like. I don't know where the difference begins or ends, but it is there. Like the way we approach things is just a little bit different. And I forgot my line of thought entirely. I'm gonna have to pass over to Naomi. Sorry. Classic ADHD. It's been about half an hour. I was walking into it at some point. I'll find my place again.
Yeah, come on.
Yeah, I thought I was going to do that at some point. I do that all the time, and my memory for words, I get really forget, words, which is really frustrating, and it's really, that was a bit scary. I think, oh God, I don't know, I'm already getting dementia or something. But yeah, I sort of struggle sometimes just to think of what I want to say, and yeah, I have to pace myself a bit, I find.
And I struggle with names. It can be really difficult socially. I think this is one of the big things is like the social effect of ADHD is under talked about in adults. They talk about slightly like children being slightly kind of socially isolated, but actually a lot of the things that you do as an adult, like when you're remembering people's names, remembering people's birthdays, and actually being able to do something like getting a card. I have strategies that sometimes work. Like whenever I'm in a shop that sells cards, I buy some cards and I have a big drawer full of cards. So when someone's birthday comes up, I might actually have a card, maybe. If I've got a stamp as well, it's amazing. But it's like, so like having piles of the stuff that I know I'm going to need is one of those. But even so, it can be very, very difficult, because you just don't have the regular connection, and you don't have that. So you'll have this amazing connection with someone when you're with them, and then it'd be like nothing, because you don't have the kind of check-ins and touches that other people can do very easily. And I think that, like, understanding that as part of your own experience, and like it's okay, and also warning people about it. I think this is one of the other big advantages of a diagnosis, actually, is I sometimes I'll say, it's not intentional. I try really, really hard to remember names, but they go and they blank on me. So it's not personal, really isn't. I blank on like everyone's name, even people I've known for ages and ages. So I'm really sorry if it happens, but it happens. And that, I think, being able to say that is really helpful, kind of ahead of time, to forewarn people a little bit about the cluster of things that that people read intention to, that don't have intention from my perspective, because I express differently, because that feels like one of the big advantages, actually, of understanding the condition a bit more.
See, for me, it's come out a little. I've got a little adaptation. When you mention names, it makes me think of it. I tend to nickname people, because I'm terrible with their actual name, but I will be able to think of a nickname, just sort of, I don't know where it comes from. Suddenly it just falls out, but then it becomes a bit of a staple. So I've also, if it's the sort of person you meet that you're like, I can't give this person a nickname, some people don't take to it very well at all, then I've just got other filler words. Like I just go up to people and say, excuse me, because there have been so many times where I've thought I've known their name, I've had it, and then got distracted, looked them in the face, and blanked. And that is the worst, because then I feel like I lose all social control. Every bit of calm I had spins out of control. That got a bit better with age, but the social anxiety was something that I utterly underestimated.
And I've only just realized, like in the last year or so, how the level of social anxiety that I was carrying all my life for exactly that reason. And that terror, I like when you're introducing someone, I cannot, like, because I will blank on people's names as I'm introducing them, or I will have this sudden big fear in my head that I'm actually about to introduce them with the wrong name. And it's like it's a constant kind of watch. Yeah, that's definitely a thing.
Like, this is where I wonder, I don't want to make it seem like it comes with it, because I don't know as if my social anxiety fully was, because it sort of just went a bit. I had bad patterns, and it did I went traveling basically, and I think throwing myself into the ether was basically like throwing myself into the good sides of ADHD that helped get rid of it. But I don't, has that been an experience for both of you? Did you have anxieties that lessened? Did you find it wavered? Because it all seemed to start from the point of diagnosis. So like the assurance of it meant that I started to think, okay, well, I don't feel so unpredictable in a social environment. Now I know to anticipate. Once I pre-warn people, I'm much less anxious, because if they judge me, well, I pre-warned them. So
yeah, I think it's hard, I think, for me, because also being a mum, or a parent, I should say, like, you get kind of forced, well, not forced, but you end up in different social situations than you did before you had children. So it's hard to kind of judge what is kind of the new sort of me, or the mum sort of me. But I have to be honest that when I first had my daughter, the idea of like socializing with people and not drinking alcohol was completely alien to me. I would think, oh my God, what if I get bored? Like, it's really awful, because I do love talking to people. I love hearing. I'm just being really honest here. I love hearing what people are saying, have a conversation. But when you become a parent, you go, obviously on this like play dates or whatever, and just have a cup of tea, and that is just something I would never have done before. I'd never. That was not on my radar at all, of like socializing. I just think that was just incredibly boring. But in fact, it isn't, and it's so nice to kind of learn that you can go out and just have a cup of tea with somebody, and not get bored, and listen to what they say, and just have a nice time, and go, see ya, and then it's so it's, I think it's been a skill I had to learn even before I had the diagnosis, because of that, really. And also I do have the thing now where my close friends are quite aware that even if we're out and we're having a great time, I might suddenly say, right, I'm going now then, and they know now why, that I'm not bored of them, I'm not particularly bored, but I just don't want to do this anymore. I just want to go home.
Too much done. Yeah.
And so that's been really good, because I've before kind of just been out way past. I want to go home.
I always used to kind of overcompensate and kind of stay till the bitter end, I think.
Yes.
Because I didn't, because it always felt like like I was going to be I was kind of like inappropriate leaving, and it was and I think that's one of the really big markers, one of the difficult things if you're exploring it, is there are all these kind of external tells, and actually quite often if we're compensated, we actually have the opposite one. So it's like, leaves. It's not, and this actually relates to ADHD and attention. It's not a deficit of attention, because we can hyperfocus and obsess, and that's one of the really bad parts of the name for me. Is like like my big problems with ADHD are actually less around, or my personal like pain, suffering comes less around the not being able to attend, and more around the excessive attention and the like, I must finish this. I must do this now. This thing that I've just read, I must do something about right now. This idea I've just had, I must do something about right now. Otherwise it's gone and it's all ruined and it's never going to be the same again. That obsessiveness and focus is actually probably at least as much the problem. And I think when we think about ADHD and when we think about like leaving early or leaving really late, you know, it's like it's not being able to get the balance right. It's not one or the other, it's the balance thing.
Balancing acts I'm not good at. But I've got a question, Matthew. Are you predominantly ADHD as in hyperactive or inattentive?
I'm combined type with a bit more inattentive.
See, I'm technically combined type. I've met people with ADD, and even see my comparison to your experience is interestingly different. And I find these the weird points because mine is particularly in the rush. Like I wouldn't even think, oh, I need to do this idea now because I'd just already be doing it. there is a body of me that's there before I'm there. And unfortunately, that has walked its way into some basically destructive behaviors when I would drink. You know, you either leave or you try and do something else. Mine would be to drink. And I suddenly noticed that my arm could move a drink to my mouth quicker than I could keep up. And I just didn't understand why. Because it is the movement for me that is really pivotal, even though I am typically inattentive. And I've noticed with ADHD there seems to be a huge difference. There's ADD, which appears to be quite focus based, and I met someone who used to fall asleep in social situations. She just used to pass out at dinners, birthdays, meetings, everything. She had no impetus to want to move, whereas in that instance I would automatically be up. I can't sleep in the day, that's absurd. So I find the poles, even though we're both diagnosed with the same thing, we're chalk and cheese, but on the same.
Yeah, I think this is one of the really big things about working out whether you have the condition before you get engaged as well, and exploring is like there are a set of things that resonate for most of us and a set of common experiences and actually some quite big differences. And that is all mediated by personality as well. You know, the ADHD is not the whole person. There are a whole load of other differences. There are cultural differences and education differences and social differences and personality differences and embodiment differences. And so actually unpicking how all of these relate is really, really hard. And you can probably only do it after the fact. So trying to unpick it like before you even have a diagnosis and say this doesn't really work. I think that's a really important point, and that it's actually got to be an exploration. And really, I think so. Maybe in terms of advice, is if some of those experiences resonate, the more experiences that resonate, definitely, but don't just base it on one person.
And also, don't base it on one idea. Of the ADHD, because the idea I had totally didn't relate. The way I look at it is, it's not like a block. People seem to act as if it's you plus this ADHD thing, and I didn't find that at all. I found it wound into my very being. Like I can't separate me and ADHD.
No,
I have no idea what I'd be like. In my head I just think I'd be less boring and everything would feel slow because I don't feel fast. Sorry, carry on.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say as well, I do think gender plays a big part in things. I am not that. I don't like to I don't really like talking about gender too much because I don't think it really kind of matters about stuff, if you see what I mean. But I do really think that particularly I would say for what I think one of the reasons I didn't get diagnosed for such a long time is because of being female, because I think society does put quite a lot of pressure on women to behave in a certain way still, and I think it can get really kind of you I think you hide it a lot more. It gets masked. I think.
Absolutely. And I think there's a kind of high empathy ADHD form that gets overlooked because it tends to lead to internalization and anxiety rather than any external behavior.
Yeah.
And obviously that's associated with women as well, and the modes of expression available are just not the ones that are associated, even though the traits are there. So yeah, I think that is one of the really, really big difficulties around this is this idea of the kind of naughty boy syndrome. Like if there's one thing that comes out of today, I'd like people to just forget that as a cliche and think about certainly that no adult with ADHD is going to present that way. So if that's what you're looking for, you're not seeing the condition, you're seeing something in your imagination.
I think the female difference is something, because not being a woman, I've obviously not ran into it many times, but I started to notice sort of what Naomi was saying, that that women that I'd sort of thought, I started to get that feeling, the click that I was like, oh, you're a little bit hyperactive. But they presented quite differently to me. But I could also see how they would freak out under pressure. And I just noticed they were always put under more of a pressure to act a certain way, to sit a certain way. And after a while of putting myself in that situation, I just thought I couldn't last 15 minutes. Someone says, you got to sit with your legs closed, you're wearing heels, you got to sit. No. So I'd see people with ADHD, females, responding more invertedly than men. So there was a difference in presentation. But then you turn to the literature and it's not really there. So I think if anything, I'd say female diagnosis is probably one of the most underdiagnosed aspects of it, because they present with quite a varied pattern according to the diagnostic material. If you compare the two, there's variance for some reason.
It is a gender diagnosis. I think there's another part of this as well, is that different people with ADHD tend to select different fixation objects. For the kind of traditional masculine cognition, those tend to be mechanical objects. So there's a lot of ADHD people that work in IT. There's a lot of ADHD people that work in mechanical things. For the kind of feminine brain, and obviously those are huge cliches and aren't very indicative, but that's what people think of them. That tends to be animals and people, and one of the consequences, and my fixation objects are people and living things. So when I'm interacting with an individual person, I don't feel like an ADHD person very much to interact with in that sense. But the rest of my life is absolutely that. I can't follow instructions. I can't do it. The rest of it, it's just I don't feel like that in a one-to-one interaction in the way that someone who is more interested in non-living things or different living things is. And so it's actually a very, very difficult thing to spot even for some professionals, I think, who expect to feel of it, that's around where your attention is, because people know when your attention is on them and when it's not. And because my attention is on them almost to an obsessive degree, they don't think that I have it. But I very much do, because I should be attending to other things.
And also opposition, I found, was one of those features that people tended to expect to see one form, but they saw another. Because I spent years battling this. I didn't seem outwardly what's the term I just used again? Sorry, I've forgotten it. They typically in diagnosed people with ADHD are they fight against authority. That's I said the word a minute ago, it's completely gone. But I didn't think I did. I thought I could be quite complicit with authority. But then as I got older, I got into jobs, I started getting yelled at by management, and they were like, "Why not listening to me?" And I thought I was. But then I looked back over what I'd done, and I wasn't. I didn't like what they said, so I just didn't do it. Oppositional, that was the one.
Oppositional defiant disorder.
And everyone expects you. If you're going to be oppositional, you're just going to be someone who's like, "Oh, fuck off." You're not.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a devious one where someone tells you to do something, and you think, "I'll do that," but I'm then going to oppose you by doing something maybe in 2 days' time that you're going to want me to do that. It's that bit that I think. Those patterns that I find can be quite ADHD, and that can be easy to dismiss because you think, "Oh, well, my attention's kind of all right." Well, that might not always be the factor.
And I realized I have an internalized version of positional defiant disorder. I do that with myself. Now, it sounds so bizarre to say, but like, I don't do the things that I want to do that I want me to do.
Yeah.
It's this bizarre, like, and it is exactly as described with oppositional defiant disorder. It's just entirely internal. I do what other people want. I just don't do what I want. And that's that. But so I've kind of internalized the same thing. I think, again, different expressions of the similar experience.
I think I do both.
Yeah,
yeah. I don't deal very well at all with being told what to do. It's got me into all sorts of trouble over the years. Not bad trouble, but you know, I just think I know what it's very like arrogant. Yeah, I think I know what to do. You don't need to tell me. I know. Blah, 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 blah. I'm the boss of me. That's one of my like classic sayings. You know, I know. Oh, it's very exhausting. But yeah.
So do you find that you get told what to do more because you're female though? Because I've definitely, since I grew up with two women, so I got to hear it a lot. My mum was very vocal about when people would tell her what to do, and randomly people would. So how have you?
Yes, yeah.
Because I can't stand it. Someone tells me what to do, and I turn into a 5-year-old. So we sound similar on that front. How did you end up dealing with it?
Well, I had I've had that was partly, yeah. I mean, I was doing something about this the other day, and I think there's certain people in society, usually in my experience, like older men, that sometimes think that they can tell you what to do. You know, in public, you don't even know them or whatever. They're just commenting about your parking or where you're walking or whatever, you know, which is kind of telling you what to do because they're sort of saying what you're doing is wrong and therefore you should be doing what they think, you know. And I think a lot of the time I was just literally having this conversation. They wouldn't say it if I was like, you know, a huge 6 foot massive bloke, you know, they would not be saying these things. But unfortunately, when they say it to me, they've picked the wrong 5'2" petite woman. And even on medication, I don't. Don't mess with me.
It's a good option to take. It's you haven't changed in a little way. You've just gotten better at telling people, don't tell me what to do. The song that I think sums it up. Then, have you heard the song "You Don't Own Me"? That's a theme tune. It's from the '60s, but I think it fits that theme wonderfully. If I was a female with ADHD, I'd be singing it from the rooftops. Because I do think to a point it would. I wouldn't be able to deal with it in your shoes.
I think you get to one of the really big challenges with all of this is that there are strategies that work for the majority of people that do not work for us. And we, as adults with ADHD, can very often come to some pretty bloody good strategies, sometimes better strategies, sometimes, not always, sometimes better strategies than the mainstream ones. Certainly better strategies for us, because we are good at some things and really bad at other things. And that when someone forces like a particular method onto us, we're denied all of our ability and we're highlighted, and all of our weaknesses highlighted. It's like, you must do it this way. And it's a very valid response to say, no, that doesn't work for me. It might work for you, doesn't work for me. I do it this way. But that's a very difficult, that takes a lot of confidence and a lot of kind of practice to do. And it's not even something that we're always allowed to do. However much confidence we might have, there might be quite significant social or organizational consequences if we do that. So I think that for me is one of the really difficult parts of it, is being able to get that message across and say, look, no, it's nothing personal. It's nothing about there's nothing wrong with your method for you, but it's wrong for me and I need to do it this way. That's a really tough conversation to have sometimes.
It is. Some people are very defensive over their old style. Like, don't reinvent the wheel. And to me, at work, I've even been told, people joke about it now because they've kind of gotten used to it. But they'll just say, like, Sam, you have to do everything differently. And yeah, I kind of do, because it's all admin. It's all stuff I'm not naturally good at. So I have a peculiar way of working, but I've managed to get it to work. So no one really questions it. That's what's nice about it. And I work in quite a normative setting where you've got to work in an office or in a courtroom, and you've got to sit. But I've even been able to. You're right. It was confidence at the start. It was cowardice. I was sort of sweating a bit. But I went and said to the judges that I kind of have to get up every hour and a half, and it will help me think straight and it'll make me be more useful. No problem. Because I find people are more tolerant if you say that beforehand than if you don't do something and then freak out or don't do it right. People tend to be less sympathetic. Whereas if you preempt, I've noticed even skeptics are just like, okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good advice.
Yes, that's really good.
And also, you know, for me, it's experimenting with it, allowing that difference, the fact that it's absolutely okay to do things differently. You know, what matters is the outcome, not the method. Fine, you know, and it's okay if you take a different path. You know, I think that for me is the really big thing. You know, to kind of take away from the work side of it for me. I want to start kind of wrapping this up now, but just as a kind of maybe a bit of a quick summary and a quick game, I'd like to ask you both if there was one thing that you kind of wish you'd known before you began, or maybe a question you wish you'd asked someone, or anything like that. One thing you wish you'd brought in, you'd kind of known ahead of time. What would that be?
Well, you start. No, you go.
I had to think about it a little bit, but then I feel like a feeling came. My advice, or the thing I wish I'd known, is that I'm not going to get all the answers I thought I'd get. I felt like a meadow of wonderful clarity would open, and it didn't. I felt like I felt more and more into custard, and that was, I think, one of the most difficult bits post-diagnosis, that I thought I'd get answers that I simply didn't. I just got more confused a little bit, but then I started to gain more appreciation after time. But yeah, I think expect that feeling a little bit.
It's quite hard. I can't really answer that. It's quite a hard question to answer in some ways. Just more, I know what my feeling was when I kind of got the diagnosis. It was partly obviously relief, and I was glad that I kind of knew, and that I could see there was then hope, and I also found that, you know, that finally I'd been understood, which was a massive relief after years of being in like the mental health system, really, as I mentioned before. But the thing I found really hard was that when people sort of talk about the positives of ADHD, once I'd found out about those, I thought, oh, like is nothing me then? I haven't even got control of the positives. You know, like I think I've mentioned to you before, Matthew. You know, I just felt like a bit of like a puppet. I thought, oh God, do I not even have my own personality? Am I just either this ADHD difficult or positive, and then that's down to ADHD. You see what I mean? It's like where is Naomi? You know, but then I just thought, oh, just get over yourself. Because, you know, there's nothing you can do. Yeah, I can't do anything about it. And obviously, I'm not the same as everybody else. I am me. So, but I had to reconcile it in my brain. Is what I'm saying. Really, it took quite a long time to do that. It was sounds a bit arrogant. I don't mean it to. But.
No, I kind of really resonate, and I think for me it was. Is it when I kind of was exploring it, it's like, well, this is a cognitive thing. This is like you know, it's going to be a bit like dyslexia in the sense of like, you know, it's a kind of attentional impairment. What I didn't understand was the emotional consequences of having had it all my life without having a diagnosis, and what having the diagnosis would mean, and actually how good some of that would be and how challenging some of that would be. I think for me, that's been the really big surprise, is it's not just a kind of cognitive thing. It's much more pervasive than that. much more woven into the fabric of me than that, and particularly the fabric of how I feel and experience emotional stuff. And that it's, for me, perhaps the biggest misunderstanding that I think is probably not my fault, a misunderstanding, but is a general misunderstanding, is that it is at least as much a condition of emotion and affect as it is of cognition and kind of planning and like sequencing. And I think for me, that was the really big thing.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, I was just going to say as well, I think it just, yeah, I think it, I would imagine too, not to take anything away from Sam, but I think the older you are when you do find out, I think it's harder because you have had this sort of sense of your identity for such a long time, so long, and you've kind of built your whole world in a way around who you kind of think you are, and also by the time you get to my age, you've had like more things go wrong that were probably linked to it, just because of the passing of time. So as I say, not I'm not at any age, it's still a shock. And as Sam and I were corresponding with one of our colleagues, really late diagnosis is anything after being a child, that's considered late diagnosis. But yes, I just, as I say, you've probably got this like a longer catalogue of fails and positives behind you. But yeah, I think it destabilizes you probably a bit more. That's just my.
No, I mean, I think it differs from person to person, but I think you're right. For as an individual,
personal, yeah.
For one person's trajectory, it's very hard to compare different people and their trajectories. But for me, for an individual trajectory, yeah, I kind of agree. The later it gets for an individual, the more integration there is. Though, like I say, it's not really comparable between different people at different ages.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's huge. For me, I think, the sooner you do engage with it, at least on some level, whether you seek formal diagnosis or not, the better. And actually allowing yourself some time and space to do that, it's valuable, whatever comes out of it. I think that's a huge bit of it. So yeah, what I'd like to do is kind of bring this to a bit of a close now. I think I really enjoyed that conversation. I hope it was useful to everyone watching as well. I think really it's raised, and the intention of this was to raise questions and explore questions. And so the more we can frame this, the better, and the more helpful content, the better. So please do get in touch with any of us around this, leave comments, share, get in touch, and we'll share some stuff, some specific stuff about how to do that in a minute. One thing I really wanted to raise, first of all, though, was that it felt like there was something very interesting around strategies there, and that we've all adopted. We've got this we've got our own little library of strategies, and I think it would be really, really interesting to look at some potentially sharing some content, some practice around like, well, what strategies do work for us. If we're saying that the normal stuff doesn't, but yeah, it doesn't. We know that. Well, what might work for us? So we have to be a bit better than trial and error. And I think sharing strategies from other people who have ADHD and have worked with this might be an interesting approach. So yeah, so what I'd like to do is I'll hand over to Sam and Naomi briefly to talk a little bit about like ADHD Aware and what can be offered, what the kind of things what the offer there is, and what they can do for you if you are in these circumstances.
Yep. Well, ADHD Aware run a lot of peer support groups and different focus sessions on different topics, which are really all the groups are really, really popular. It's all on Zoom at the moment, but hopefully resuming in person in Brighton maybe soon, hopefully. And also the website's got a lot of useful links and resources that people can get in touch with us. And it would probably be me who would respond to your email.
As you did when I first got in touch.
Yeah. So, could you add anything to that, Sam? Anything you want to?
I think my sort of input has been quite recent. I know ADHD Aware as an organisation has really started getting onto its feet, I think, as of this sort of 2021. So I'd say in terms of input, I do really think some more engagement from people with ADHD would always be amazing and always useful, because we need to start having centres to contribute to. And I'm hoping that the more people contribute to it, the more the writing of what we're talking about can vary, and the more people can get included to actually speak about it. So really, for my interest, it would be if you've got stories, things, because sometimes even just writing something to an organisation like this can feel a form of catharsis. So it might always be helpful just to think, is this as weird as I think it is? Because normally it's not. It's not weird at all. We just seem to think it is in our head. But the more that can be given through examples, correspondence, comments, anything will always be helpful.
Yep.
That's brilliant. Thank you. So from my perspective, if you're specifically looking at work and innovation and change, and you are led to do things differently in a work context and want to turn that into something kind of different, then I run a community called Divergent Pathfinders, which is specifically for people who are really turning their neurodivergence, their difference, their kind of inward thinking and feeling differently about the world into positive change, into innovation and social innovation in particular, and just doing things differently. It can be a very, very difficult space to work in, because no one will, because for all the reasons you're kind of not invited to make this kind of change, some of the reasons we touched on earlier. And it's really helpful to have a group of people around you who are on a similar journey and who get it. And I created the community to really be a safe space to try this stuff out, reclaim some of it. For me, the journey personally has been like, well, how do I turn these bits of me into something I'm proud of? You know, how do I turn this into something that's really valuable to me and other people? And quite a lot of that is through my working identity. And so I specifically work in that space. So if that's something interesting to you, then please do get in touch. I'm going to be running some events and stuff soon, similarly on Zoom, and then hopefully again in Brighton and various other places later on in the year as stuff opens up. I'd love to hear from you if that's you and you're kind of interested in entrepreneurship, founders, doing stuff different, you work for yourself, any of that stuff. Come and join us. That's basically it from me. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this has been really useful for you. If you do reach out, I think this is one of the first things is, if you're not sure, still reach out. That can be the hardest thing. You're probably not faking it. You probably really do have something that's worth talking to. So I've spent a lot of time with imposter syndrome, thinking that I was basically faking my ADHD. Turns out I wasn't helping. So please do reach out to us, to someone anyway, to anyone, not necessarily us, but someone. We're here if you need us. That's basically it. Thank you very much for watching. I really thank you for the conversation, Naomi, Sam. Really thank you for joining me. So I really thought that was very interesting. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
All right, cheers and goodbye.